August 18, 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The sun turned the barbed wire to gold, the heat almost unbearable. Behind the fences, German women in uniform stared at American cooks roasting whole ears of corn. "That's animal feed," they whispered, barely holding back laughter. The husks blackened, butter hissed, and a sweet, smoky scent drifted through the dusty air. It was simple, ordinary, and completely unfamiliar. Then a sergeant peeled back a husk and held out a steaming ear. One bite, he promised, would change everything. The paradox was clear. What they mocked as pig fodder smelled like food, tasted like summer, and carried a secret history they had never imagined. This wasn't propaganda. It was reality, and it would challenge everything they believed about American life. Stick around, watch the full story, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. You won't want to miss how a single vegetable shook the world views of German prisoners. August 18, 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The sun pressed down like a hammer on corrugated tin roofs, making even shadows shimmer. Behind the barbed wire perimeter, rows of women in patched Wehrmacht uniforms squinted toward the mess yard, where smoke rose from improvised grills. What they saw made them laugh. Short, mocking bursts that carried the bite of superiority. "Mais für Tiere," one of them muttered in clipped German, corn for animals. Their contempt spread through the ranks like a contagion. The source of their ridicule was simple: whole ears of corn, husks still clinging, blackening over the flames. In Germany, corn was silage, chopped and thrown into troughs for pigs and cattle. No officer, no officer's daughter, no educated woman of the Reich would dare eat it. To watch Americans treat it as food, even a delicacy, felt absurd. Yet the scene was heavy with paradox. Here stood the prisoners of a collapsing empire, mocking the captors who fed them meat twice a week, bread by the loaf, and fresh milk delivered daily. In wartime Germany, rations had dwindled to watery soups and thin slices of dark rye. By 1944, average German bread contained only 55% wheat, the rest stretched with barley, oats, and even sawdust fillers. But still, they scoffed, an instinctive defense against humiliation. Helga Richter, a 28-year-old signals officer, watched with folded arms. In later notes, she would confess, "We had nothing like this. Yet we told ourselves it was crude, unrefined. Better to believe they were peasants than admit they were ahead of us." The camp itself was a paradox in stone and wire. Concordia had housed nearly 4,000 German prisoners by that summer, many of them highly trained personnel. Women officers, rare and carefully guarded, were clustered together. Their daily routine balanced boredom with the humiliation of dependence, roll calls, inspectio, letters from home redacted by censors. But food was the one arena where America demonstrated its quiet, relentless power. Numbers told the same story. By 1944, the United States harvested more than 3 billion bushels of corn annually, more than half the world's production. Kansas alone dedicated over 7 million acres to the crop, producing yields that dwarfed European fields. Against such abundance, ridicule was a fragile shield. An American sergeant, sleeves rolled to the elbow, approached the group. His hands were stained with butter and ash as he lifted an ear from the grill, peeled back the husk, and extended it like an offering. Steam curled into the air, carrying a scent that didn't match their contempt. Sweet, roasted, faintly nutty. One German whispered, barely audible, "Es riecht gut." It smells good. Still, no one stepped forward. Pride was thicker than hunger. But the seed of contradiction had been planted. In their world, corn was for livestock. In this world, it shimmered with butter under an open sky. The laughter faltered. Curiosity stirred, dangerous as any weapon. That evening, Camp Command announced something unusual, a cultural exchange dinner, where the prisoners would be invited to sit at long wooden tables and taste American cooking alongside their guards. Helga scrawled in her diary, "We laughed at the idea, yet something in the smell of that corn unsettled me. It was as though the earth itself was telling us we were wrong." What began with mockery would soon become revelation, for when they finally tasted the golden kernels, their certainty shattered like glass under heat. Evening settled over Camp Concordia like a velvet curtain, the blazing Kansas sun replaced by the amber glow of lanterns strung above long tables. Prisoners and guards alike gathered in wary silence, the unusual arrangement alone stirring unease. For weeks, meals had been routine, tin trays, rations counted, bread weighed. But tonight something was different. The smell told them so, smoky char clinging to the air, mingled with melted butter and the faint sweetness of roasted corn. Helga Richter sat stiffly, flanked by 2 other officers. She had sworn not to touch it, the so-called delicacy of peasants. Yet when a wooden platter was set before them, stacked with steaming golden ears, her resolve faltered. The kernels glistened, plump and translucent, like beads of amber. An American corporal offered salt from a small tin shaker, his grin a mixture of mischief and hospitality. "Not pig feed," he quipped. "Supper." The first to taste was not Helga, but her comrade, Annalise Bauer, a sharp-tongued intelligence clerk. She tore away a husk, muttered something about humiliation, and bit in anyway. The crack was audible, a snap of skin against teeth. Then came the silence. Annalise froze, eyes wide, before chewing slowly. "Es ist süß," she whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and shame. "It's sweet." Laughter that had once been sharp with mockery now broke in startled bursts. Women leaned forward, pulling ears from the pile, butter dripping down their fingers. Helga resisted, gripping her lap until her knuckles whitened. But hunger and curiosity pressed harder than pride. Finally, she lifted one, tentative as if handling contraband, and bit. It was a shock. Not fodder, not rough kernels for cattle, but delicate sweetness, a taste that burst across her tongue like sunlight. Heat, sugar, smoke, salt, all of it mingled into something no German ration had ever delivered. She later recalled, "We thought them crude. Yet in that first bite, I realized they had mastered nature in ways we had never imagined." The paradox deepened. Germany, proud of its science, had overlooked this simple marvel. Cornfields existed across Bavaria, but only for feed, chopped to silage. Sweet corn had never been cultivated for human mouths. In America, by contrast, plant breeders had perfected hybrid varieties, doubling yields within a generation. By 1940, US farms averaged 31 bushels of corn per acre. Germany, even with meticulous precision, struggled to reach half that. Around the table, the German women murmured in disbelief. One guard, catching their whispers, offered a history lesson in plain English. "Our ancestors learned this from the Indians. Thousands of years ago, they turned a wild grass into this. We just kept going." His words carried no arrogance, only fact. For Helga, it was another wound to certainty. If corn was indeed born from indigenous knowledge, nurtured across centuries, then Germany's dismissal was not superiority. It was ignorance. Lantern light caught the steam rising from plates. The sound of chewing replaced ridicule. Butter pooled in the grooves of wood, salted hands wiped against trousers. The Germans ate until they were quiet, until the only thing left was the soft crackle of husks curling in the fire. Yet pride lingered, stubborn as barbed wire. One officer muttered, "Even so, it is only sugar, nothing more." But her voice lacked conviction. The paradox was too sharp, too immediate. If America could turn what they dismissed as animal fodder into something this refined, what else had they misunderstood? As night deepened, Helga walked back to the barracks under a spangled Kansas sky. She carried the taste on her tongue like an unshakable ghost. It was not propaganda, she wrote that night. It was real, and it forced me to wonder what else we had been wrong about. The dinner had been only an opening act. The true revelations would not come from the mess tables, but from the soil itself, the rows of green beyond the wire, where America's quiet revolution in agriculture waited to be seen. Dawn in Kansas came not with fog or drizzle, as Helga remembered from her Rhineland childhood, but with a blaze of light so immediate it seemed to strike the land like artillery. Cicadas whirred in the grass. The prairie wind tugged at the fence posts. That morning, the prisoners were led not to the mess yard, but toward a patch of earth that shimmered green in the sun, the camp's demonstration garden. Helga walked with her hands folded behind her back, the habit of an officer still ingrained. Around her, The women muttered, their voices laced with suspicion. Gardens, after all, were familiar. Germany had its Kleingarten, its tidy plots behind houses, its well-kept rows of potatoes and cabbage. But what they saw here was no garden in the domestic sense. It was a lesson. Stalks of corn towered above them, taller than a man, leaves wide and sharp as blades. Some ears were already mature, their husks fat, silk threads drying in the heat. Beside them grew smaller plots of beans, squash, and even popcorn plants, their ears compact, kernels tight as polished beads. A USDA officer, white hat pulled low, greeted them in careful German. Damen, willkommen. This is not propaganda. This is how America feeds itself. The paradox was immediate. For women who had grown up with strict divisions between crops for humans and crops for livestock, the sight of multiple corn varieties, each with a purpose, defied what they thought they knew. Field corn, the officer explained, was for animals, yes, but also for grinding into meal, starch, syrup, and fuel. Sweet corn was bred for tenderness and sugar. Popcorn was ancient, used for both ceremony and snack. H has its place, he said, holding up an ear of each like a professor with specimens. The statistics shocked them. By 1940, Kansas farmers alone produced over 250 million bushels annually. Hybrid seeds, pioneered in the 1920s and adopted rapidly through the 1930s, had doubled yields in less than 2 decades. Germany, clinging to older varieties, struggled to increase output at all. We thought ourselves the scientific nation, Helga later reflected, but here we saw fields that were laboratories, and the results were undeniable. She bent down, touched the soil. It was rich, loamy, dark with life. One farmer, recruited by the camp for demonstrations, explained crop rotation, corn one year, soybeans the next, wheat following, a cycle that restored nitrogen and kept yields high. Helga's training in signals had never touched agriculture, but she understood systems. She saw at once that this was not chance, it was design. The women were invited to taste popcorn, roasted in a pan over open flame. The kernels cracked like rifle shots, white blossoms spilling into the air, salted and passed in small bowls. The Germans laughed, this time not with scorn but genuine surprise. Es springt, one of them exclaimed. It jumps. The crunch, the warmth, the novelty made them forget for a moment their captivity. But alongside wonder came unease. If America could devote such ingenuity to food, hybridizing, rotating, mechanizing, what did that say about its factories, its arsenals, its war machine? The same hands that bred sweet corn also built B-29 bombers. The same farmers who coaxed yields from the prairie also produced the grain that fed entire armies overseas. Helga scribbled in her notebook, the words careful, deliberate. This abundance is not luck, it is a weapon. As the women filed back toward the wire, the wind carried the rustle of corn leaves, a sound like whis, pairing voices in a foreign tongue. They had eaten its sweetness, now they had seen its roots. But the greatest revelation still waited, outside the fences, where America's farms stretched unbroken to the horizon. The trucks rattled along a dirt road flanked by endless fields. The barbed wire of Camp Concordia had vanished behind them, replaced by the open sweep of Kansas prairie. Dust trailed like banners in the late summer air. For the first time since capture, the German women were outside the fences, on assignment. To work, but also, though they did not yet know it, to witness. Helga Richter sat on the wooden bench in the back, clutching her cap against the wind. Around her the others murmured, still half in disbelief. "They take us to farms?" one whispered. "Not factories, not punishment, but farms?" The paradox was sharp. Prisoners of war brought not to labor camps, but to the very households that fed their captors' nation. The Schmidt farm lay just west of town, 300 acres of rolling corn and wheat. At the gate stood Wilhelm Schmidt, third-generation German-American, his English laced with the faint shadow of Swabian vowels. He welcomed the prisoners with a handshake, his wife offering water from a tin pail. Hospitality in wartime. That alone unsettled Helga more than the barbed wire ever had. The work began with machinery. A hulking combine harvester growled to life, its belts and blades moving in practiced rhythm. The Germans stared as it rolled through a field, cutting, threshing, and cleaning grain in a single pass. In the Reich, such machines were rare, often reserved for state-run estates. Here, on a family farm, they were common. Statistics painted the contrast. By 1940, the US had nearly 1.2 million tractors in operation. Germany, fewer than 200,000. American farms averaged 175 acres. German farms, barely 30. Mechanization was not an exception, but the rule. Watching the combine devour rows of corn in minutes, Anneliese Bauer-Mu said, "We work all day by hand for what this does in an hour." The paradox stung. Germany, which prided itself on efficiency, had been overtaken by the so-called land of amateurs. The Schmitz explained crop rotation, irrigation pumps, fertilizer shipments delivered by rail. Each fact sharpened the realization. This abundance was deliberate, engineered, repeatable. And yet, the farm was not cold or clinical. At noon, the prisoners were invited to sit at the long wooden table in the kitchen. The smell of roast chicken, cornbread, and fresh vegetables filled the room. Helga watched Mrs. Schmidt butter cornbread and pass it across without hesitation, her gesture as natural as offering bread to neighbours. For women trained to expect suspicion or cruelty, the warmth felt disarming. Helga recorded later, "We sat in their kitchen, ate from their plates and could not reconcile it. In Germany, captives would never be treated thus. We mocked their corn, yet they gave us their table." The sensory memory lingered. The soft crumb of cornbread, the tang of buttermilk, the sound of the windmill creaking outside. Work resumed, but the lesson was already planted deeper than any furrow. The Schmidt children ran laughing between rows, their pockets stuffed with popcorn kernels. Abundance was not guarded here, it was shared. By evening, as the sun sank into the flat horizon, Helga stood at the edge of a field and looked out. The corn stretched unbroken to where the land met the sky, green rows vanishing into distance. It was then she realized the true scale. In this country, food was not rationed by stamps or dictated by scarcity. It was grown until it seemed infinite. She wrote that night, "They do not fear hunger. That alone changes how they think of war, of the future, of themselves. For us, bread crusts are survival. For them, even prisoners eat sweet corn until they are full." So, but abundance was not only in the fields. It waited in the kitchens too, where corn transformed from a curiosity to a staple, baked, boiled, fried, and reborn into dishes the Germans had never imagined. The clatter of pans echoed through the camp kitchen like a kind of martial drumbeat. But this was no mess hall ration line. It was a classroom, one that smelled of yeast, frying oil, and butter. Rows of German prisoners leaned on counters, sleeves rolled, watching as American cooks demonstrated what corn could become once it left the stalk. Helga stood near the front, arms crossed, skeptical but curious. She had tasted the grilled corn and sat at the Schmidt's table, yet she still half believed that sweetness was a trick of novelty. But then the cooks laid out the spread. Cornbread golden from the oven, fritters crisp and hissing with oil, corn pudding soft as custard, and spoon bread so light it seemed to breathe. The contrast with the black bread of wartime Germany could not have been sharper. The head cook, a heavy-set Kansan with forearms like tree trunks, cut squares of cornbread and passed them down the line. "This ain't pig feed," he said, his voice carrying a hint of pride. "This is Sunday dinner." The prisoners laughed nervously, but when they bit in, silence followed. Helga's teeth sank through a crisp edge into a moist, crumbly heart. Butter soaked through the warm bread, mingling with the faint sweetness of cornmeal. The taste was unlike anything she had known, neither coarse nor bland, but balanced, comforting, complete. She later admitted, "Our rye bread was our pride, but it was heavy, a labour. This bread was light, almost joyful. It carried no weight of hunger." Anneliese sampled corn pudding, its texture smooth, custard-like, flecked with golden kernels. She set down her spoon and shook her head slowly, as though she'd been struck. "It cannot be so simple," she muttered. Yet it was. Corn. A milk, eggs, a little sugar, heat. No complicated recipes, no scarcity, just abundance turned into nourishment. Statistics again reinforced the shock. By 1944, American households consumed nearly 700 million pounds of cornmeal annually, transformed into everything from baked goods to coatings for fried meat. Corn sugar production topped £1 billion, fueling both food and industry. Germany, by comparison, imported much of its sugar before the war. Blockades had strangled that supply. The difference was not taste alone, but infrastructure, a system designed to feed, to fuel, to last. The sensory immersion overwhelmed the women. The sizzle of fritters in hot oil, the sweet smell rising as spoon bread puffed in the oven, the crunch and softness colliding in every bite. What they once mocked as fodder now seemed infinitely adaptable. One prisoner scribbled in her diary, "If corn can become so many dishes, what else have they hidden from us?" But not all were convinced. A few muttered about wastefulness, about extravagance. "They drown it in butter, in sugar," one said. "It is indulgence, not necessity." Yet even she took a second helping. The tongue betrayed the ideology. Helga, tasting fritters dusted with salt, felt the contradiction settle heavy. She had once prided herself on German precision, German discipline. Yet here, in this simple kitchen, she was taught a different kind of mastery. Not of scarcity, but of abundance. "They turn grain into comfort," she wrote that night. "We turned it into silence for cattle." The lesson was no longer academic. Food carried meaning beyond calories. It carried culture, philosophy, power. If corn could be so transformed, perhaps their ideas could be too. As the women filed out of the kitchen, bellies warm and hands still slick with butter, they felt the shift more deeply than they dared admit. Mockery had become curiosity. Curiosity now edged toward respect, and respect, Helga sensed, was the first step toward change. Yet her own transformation was only beginning. In the months ahead, she would step into a role neither she nor her captors had expected. Not just a student of American farming, but a messenger for what she had learned. The October sun slanted low across the camp, gilding the fences in bronze. The air smelled faintly of harvest, dry husks, smoke from distant fields, and the earthy sweetness of grain. It was here, after supper one evening, that Helga found herself summoned by the camp commandant. She expected a reprimand. Instead, she was asked to teach. American officers had noticed her attentiveness during the corn demonstrations. She asked questions others dismissed. She scribbled notes, comparing measurements, translating terms into German shorthand. "You have the training," the commandant said, handing her a small ledger and chalk. "Perhaps you can explain it to your fellow prisoners." Helga balked. She was a trained communications officer, not a farmhand. Yet she agreed, if only to prove to herself that she remained in control. The next morning, under the shade of an old oak, she stood before 30 German women, chalking diagrams of cornstalks, kernels and milling processes on a salvaged board. Her first paradox struck her before she spoke a word. In Germany, she had been the voice of orders. Here she was the voice of learning. "In the Reich," she began slowly, "we fed this to animals. Here they feed it to children." Laughter rippled through the group, but she pressed on. She outlined the staggering numbers she had memorized. America harvested nearly 80 million acres of corn annually, producing over 2.8 billion bushels during wartime, more than enough to fuel both human diets and the ethanol plants powering war machinery. By comparison, German rye harvests could not keep pace with military requisitions, let alone civilian needs. The contrast was not ideological. It was mathematical. Anneliese raised her hand, challenging. "But isn't this waste? To feed men with what could fatten swine?" Helga hesitated, then recounted what she had learned from an American farmer. Corn was not a single-use crop. Its byproducts became animal feed. Its sugars became industrial alcohol. Its oil became cooking fuel. Its cobs even burned in stoves. "They waste nothing," she said, chalk snapping in her hand. "The waste is ours. We never looked twice." Witness voices soon crept into her teaching. One woman read aloud from a pamphlet smuggled from the kitchen. "1 ear of corn can be ground for bread, creamed for stew, dried for winter." Another prisoner muttered, almost resentful, "So simple. Why did no one tell us?" The sensory world of those lessons carried weight too. Helga described the texture of cornmeal, gritty between the fingers, yet soft once baked. She mimicked the hiss of oil when fritters hit the pan. She passed around a kernel, letting each woman feel its glassy hardness, daring them to imagine it transformed. The classroom was not only numbers and diagrams, it was sound, touch, taste. And something shifted. The women leaned closer. They took notes. They debated. The camp's guards, leaning on their rifles at the edge of the circle, sometimes paused to listen. Helga was no longer mocking, nor merely curious. She was translating abundance into a new language. Yet she struggled privately with guilt. In her diary, she wrote, "I speak of corn as though it were salvation. But what of those in the Reich who starve? What of mothers who cannot find bread? Have I betrayed them by marveling at the plenty of our captors?" Her paradox deepened when she realized her teaching was not only tolerated, but encouraged. Americans believed knowledge was not a weapon to guard, but a gift to spread. Helga, once an enemy officer, was being an ass. Trusted with their agricultural gospel, it unsettled her, but it also gave her purpose. That night, as she closed her ledger and set the chalk aside, she realized she had crossed an invisible threshold. No longer just a prisoner, she had become a messenger. What she carried was not propaganda, not coercion, but reality. And that reality, she knew, would be impossible to silence once the war ended. But the true test of her transformation was still ahead, waiting beyond the barbed wire. Winter arrived with a sharpness the women had not felt since Germany. Frost clung to the camp fences, boots crunched over frozen ground, and breath hung white in the morning air. Yet unlike the winters of home, filled with cold kitchens, empty larders, and ration cards that seemed more like ration jokes, this camp winter carried the smell of warm bread and roasted cornmeal porridge rising from the mess hall. Helga's classes continued, though now the lessons reached beyond the walls. Once a week, selected prisoners were escorted to nearby farms. There they saw firsthand how American abundance was not an accident of luck but the product of systems. Silos towered like monuments of plenty, corn stored dry and safe against mold. Tractors roared across fields even in the chill, their gasoline derived partly from corn alcohol. On one farm, Helga counted 3 separate barns filled with corn not yet needed. The farmer, noticing her wide eyes, chuckled. "It'll keep till spring. There's always more where that came from." The paradox cut deep. In the Reich, they had been told the Allies suffered shortages, that America was stretched thin by war. Yet here was surplus stacked higher than a man, guarded not by soldiers but by dogs napping in the sun. As Helga later wrote, "We fought for bread crusts while they stored mountains." Statistics turned disbelief into certainty. Reports from 1944 showed US farmers produced over 3 billion bushels of corn, enough to feed the population, and supply the military and still export millions of tons abroad. Germany, by contrast, had rationed bread to as little as 200 grams per person per day, supplemented with ersatz fillers. The numbers were merciless. Propaganda dissolved in their light. Annaliese's reaction was more visceral. Watching a farmer's wife crumble leftover cornbread into a chicken trough, she whispered to Helga, "At home, a family would fight for those scraps. Here, even the chickens dine better." The smell of fresh loaves cooling on the windowsill only deepened her disquiet. Yet not all responses were bitter. Some prisoners began sketching recipes in their diaries. Cornbread measured against grams, spoonbread imagined with rationed milk. They whispered of returning home one day, bringing with them not only memories, but techniques. "This is knowledge worth more than rations," one said quietly. Helga's role grew with each farm visit. She translated farmers' explanations into German, explained crop rotation, milling, storage. Guards listened as intently as prisoners, for even they seemed to sense something profound. Food was not just sustenance but civilization itself. The women, once officers and technicians, now became apprentices of agriculture. Sensory memory anchored these lessons. The sweet smoke of corn husks burning in stoves, the crunch of cornbread crust under knife, the golden dust of meal clinging to fingertips, all stayed with them longer than lectures or numbers. Helga remarked, "We learned by taste what no speech could teach." But with understanding came unease. Some feared they were being softened, seduced into forgetting their duty. Others argued that truth was not seduction, but liberation. Around barrack stoves, they debated late into the night. "If this is propaganda, it is the most edible kind," joked one, tearing into a slice of spoon bread. The transition was complete when Helga caught herself defending American methods against her fellow prisoners' doubts. She had not chosen this role, but it had chosen her. She was no longer merely recording a paradox, she was embodying it. As winter thawed into spring, the women's perception of America had changed irrevocably. They had come expecting deprivation, only to find overabundance. They had mocked corn as animal feed, only to learn it was foundation, fuel, and feast. And in Helga's heart, a quiet certainty took root. This knowledge would outlast captivity. The war was not yet over, but already seeds had been planted that would grow long after the barbed wire rusted away. Spring 1945. The world beyond the fences was collapsing. Germany's cities lay in ruins, its armies in retreat, its people hungry beyond words. Inside the American camp, however, life pulsed with a rhythm that felt almost unreal. Steady meals, steady supplies, the hum of trucks bringing in more grain than the prisoners thought a single nation could consume. Helga watched the news trickle in. The Reich broken. Hitler's promises shattered. She had taught her fellow prisoners about corn, about American methods, about abundance. But now, as surrender loomed, she realized she had been preparing them for something greater, a world they would have to re-enter, carrying truths their leaders had sworn could not exist. The paradox was undeniable. They had entered the war believing Germany led civilization, that discipline and efficiency outmatched all rivals. Yet in captivity, they discovered the opposite. America's excess, what they had derided as softness, was in fact its strength. Mountains of grain, fields stretching horizon to horizon, the ability to feed both soldiers abroad and civilians at home without collapse. What the Reich portrayed as weakness was in reality resilience. Hard numbers confirmed what their senses had already told them. By 1945, US corn yields had reached over 90 bushels per acre in some regions, fueling not only bread and livestock, but whiskey, ethanol, even wartime explosives derived from corn-based alcohol. Germany, by contrast, rationed daily calories to starvation levels. Substitutes like sawdust, bread and coffee from acorns became the norm. One prisoner wrote in her journal, "We fought with iron, they fought with bread, and bread won." The women spoke often of what they would tell their families. Annalise, once disdainful, now whispered, "I will never again call corn fodder. It is the food of survival, of comfort." Another prisoner confessed, "I came to hate the word propaganda, for now I see the lie was ours. Truth was baked into every loaf." The sensory echoes remained strongest. The smell of spoon bread, the crunch of cornbread crust, the sweetness of pudding on the tongue. These memories would outlast statistics or lectures. Food was the language that had pierced ideology. Helga, reflecting in her final weeks of captivity, understood the deepest lesson. "They did not conquer us with cruelty, but with abundance," she wrote. "Our chains were not iron, but the realization that they had what we lacked, the means to feed every mouth." As the women prepared for repatriation, the camp faded into memory, but its paradox endured. They had come as prisoners, mocking, scornful, certain of their superiority. They left as students, carrying notebooks filled with recipes, diagrams, and figures that would reshape how they saw not only America, but the future. The war had been won with tanks, ships, and bombers, but also with silos, tractors, and fields of golden corn. And when history judged, it revealed that abundance itself was a weapon more devastating than scarcity. They had come as conquerors, they left as learners. They had mocked corn as animal feed. They departed knowing it was sustenance, strength, and survival. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, but its abundance.